Director of the film program and professor of film studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And needless to say, he has published some key works on theoretical questions that are at the core of this conference, starting with the question of authorship. That Cinema Without Walls is another book that all of us necessarily need to read if we are getting involved with film studies. But more crucially, he has written that fantastic work that I have been hearing it cited at all panels that I've attended today, which is called The Essay Film from Montaigne After Macaire. And so nobody better than Timothy Corrigan to give the keynote address today to us. Welcome, Timothy.
Thank you very much, Lucia. Very generous words. And thank you and Igor for organizing this fantastic conference. It's the only problem I'm having with it at all is there's so many interesting things to go to. And one of my positions, which we can argue about, is the way in which the essay really does initiate this kind of unstable, split, multiplied subjectivity in certain sorts of ways. And I really wish I could do that here, so I could jump around, see more of these really interesting panels. When I started thinking about this way back before some of you guys were born, in the 1990s, it was a kind of arcane term, this notion of the essay film. I mean, it didn't spring from nowhere, but it was still, I would usually get raised eyebrows when I mentioned I was going to start working on this. And to see a conference like this, and in fact other kinds of conferences, not to mention the many kinds of filmmaking that are associated with this practice in such a short time, is fascinating to me. I mean, I got interested in it originally because, and I still do think it's, if not the most important, one of the most important practices within contemporary film and media culture. And my interest in this has been exclusively in film culture, and my work has followed this as it's moved from its literary heritage through a brief stop in its heritage with the photo essay, but mainly I've been interested in film, in where it picked up the baton and what it's done with it since. I think if I wasn't such a Luddite, I would press ahead and see where this is going in terms of things like the internet and other kinds of new media, but I'll leave that to you. It's one of the problems, I think, as this term has evolved, that is the essay film, but one of the challenges, I think, is that it sometimes comes to mean, I think, in a kind of awkward way, almost anything. That you find people and filmmakers saying, well, I do essay films, or that's an essay film. And one of my projects in writing about this was to try and differentiate and give it in some ways stricter or more restrictive borders. Now, I'm not going to stand by those forever because I think, I'm nothing if not a polemicist. And I think, what I wanted to do is in some ways work against the grain where to talk about this within the history of documentaries and what really makes it different, if it is different today, or if it has, since it's in some ways emerged. And secondly, I think to differentiate it from terms which followed a lot of the films and filmmakers, excuse me, I was interested in, where you would see it referred to as personal documentaries or meta-documentaries and a variety of other terms like that. And these seemed dissatisfying to me because I felt something more specific was going on that may have in some ways originated out of a documentary tradition, but was very much, in many ways, more than just about documentaries. And certainly I wasn't satisfied with the notion of just personal documentaries. It didn't seem to me to do justice to the rigor and complexity of this form when in some ways it's executed in its most essential ways, I think. And I will just say this as a kind of stepping back, is that the kinds of films that I'm interested in, or what I'm interested in terms of the essay film tradition, doesn't describe a lot of films which could fit into this tradition. So, just as I think my definition is somewhat restrictive, and my historical markers get me into many arguments, I have to say, because I take a position which, I say the 40s, you've got your precursors going back to, Man with the Movie Camera and so forth. But for me, the watershed years become the 1940s. And if we want to talk about that, we can. But I do get into friendly and sometimes unfriendly arguments with my colleagues about that marker. And then in terms of my, in some ways, conceptual theoretical arrangement for this, it's not a particularly radical definition or schema, but it situates it in, as many of you have been talking about, a notion of the personal, or what I call a subjective expression, as it engages a public sphere or public domain, which is often with this kind of films, but not always, associated with the everyday in one sense or another. And out of that interaction, in terms of my model, it generates both on-screen and off-screen a particular kind of thinking or thought process, which I think significantly differentiates it as a model for spectatorship within the history of spectatorship. The piece of this which I think in some ways is, for me, most necessary and perhaps most controversial is this notion of a subjective expression of one sort. Because the common use of that term with the essay and the essay film is that it becomes about a personal expression. This is what I think. This is how I see the world. And people like Philip Lopate, who's done some really seminal work on this, takes that kind of stance. I think Laura Roscaroli, whose work I really admire, also sort of takes that kind of stance in suggesting that subjective expression is, in Laura's words, a kind of strong enunciator. My polemical position on this is that subjective position is about not so much projecting oneself, but of undoing oneself. That the process itself becomes a kind of undoing or a remaking of that along the way. So that's my larger scheme, and what I'm going to do now is refine even more, try and become more problematic in terms of how I distinguish terms in terms of the essay, the essayistic, and essayism along the way. Now I'm going to have 3 parts to this, just to warn you as we move forward. I'm going to set it up with some sort of theoretical boundaries, not too long. Then I'm going to launch into a reading of a couple of films through this model, this framework that I'm using. And then I have a coda, that really gets me in trouble, which is, turning some of these issues to contemporary media culture and how it may in some ways impact the world we live in. And but that will be short at the end. And a word that you'll hear that's floating around here is value. And I apologize in advance if it crops up in murky ways, because it's something I'm thinking about in bigger terms, so I'm always trying to sneak it in as a way of testing it out. So I'll get to it now. That the essay and the essay film as a particular practice seems to me to be about a singular rhetorical organization, or if you like, genre. But of course the paradox there is the essay and the essay film, following some theoretical thoughts, is fundamentally anti-generic. But it's that coherent singular practice that I associate with that form of representation. The essayistic, for me, is an inflection or tactic within another primary practice. So you might talk about an essayistic poem, for instance, an essayistic installation, or with the wonderful film I just saw, you might talk about essayistic theater along the way too, as a kind of inflection within that practice. And finally, essayism, which is, for me, a dissipation or intellectual pause of that primary practice. So it in some ways invades a primary practice such as the lyric or theater or any other sort of traditional practice. In their relationship to these other practices, these primary practices, or for my purpose specifically to narrative, each of the three represents a different representational ratio as assimilative, which is the essay film, whereby the structure and perspective of the essay supersedes and assimilates other representational organizations, as inflective, whereby the essayistic defines and distinguishes as it defers to another practice, or as a dissipation or digression, whereby essayism intervenes within and disrupts those traditional practices and their positionings. My title obviously draws on the third mode and aims to describe and argue a way in which the heritage and distinctions of the essay take a somewhat different form and path from those described more essentially by the essay film. Here I wish to investigate how in significantly different ways essayism puts that thinking of the essayistic and essay films into a play as an intellectual and structural detour within the presiding shape of a contemporary film narrative, as a figurative disruption, like a digression that questions at its heart the experiential mode of film narrative itself. To be more specific and schematic, essayism questions the organizational knowledge of film narrative, one, through the disintegration of narrative agency, two, through the exploration of the margins of narrative temporality as history, and three, through the questioning of the teleological knowledges that have conventionally sustained and shaped narrative. Another warning here, when I was rereading this, I realized I've got all these 1, 2, 3s here and stuff. I think this is leftover from when I was a math major. I don't know. This framework and focus emerged from my work with the essay film proper, where I examined a specific kind of essay film that interrogates and pursues questions of cinematic value. Adapting Bazan's term, I have described this particular brand of essay films, which include Kiarostami's Close-Up and von Trier's 5 Obstructions, as reflective essays that reflexively examine the changing values of modern cinematic images. Although films which incorporate essayism are not what I'd call, strictly speaking, essay films, they are, I argue, a version of a film practice whereby essayism inhabits narrative in a way that generates complex reflections on the representational values embedded within their narrative organizations. Now, there's a background for this, and it's a book that some of you may know. It was from the 1990s, a Thomas Harrison study of the novels of Joseph Conrad, Robert Musil, and Luigi Pirandello, titled Essayism. In this investigation, Harrison examines how the very different narratives of these different novelists mobilize essayism as an epistemological reflexivity on the perspectives and structures of the narratives that they enact. According to Harrison, in these cases, and I'm quote without mentioning in quotations, in these cases, not only does the essay give shape to the process preceding narrative conviction and perhaps deferring it forever, more important, it records the hermeneutical situation in which such decisions are made. For this reason, the essay ultimately requires, for Harrison, novelistic form. Obviously, I don't agree with this, which can portray the living conditions in which thought is entangled. Essayism thus initiates, and I'm quoting again, an imminent critique of norms and structures of narrative, whose, quote, hermeneutical suspicions turn inward toward the objectification defining the active subject, the agent of the narrative, showing that the real story to be the story of interpreting the story. Narrative essayism foregrounds a process, and this is a term which I think is really suggestive for many of the talks I've been hearing today and for my ideas about the essay. It shows that the real story to be the interpreting the story, foregrounding a process of derealization. And you can hear in that term, particularly its relationship to a documentary tradition, wait a minute, documentary is about realization, but I think this is a key term. Caused not by a characterological flaw in a protagonist, but rather by the disturbance and implosion of those structures, ideas, values, facts, judgments, and laws that define the truth of the everyday. Now there's another background for this too, less academic perhaps, which is Herman Brosch's term, the gnosiological novel. That's a term you can use at cocktail parties anywhere, the gnosiological novel. A narrative structure, perspective, and strategies that focuses its investigations on the very possibilities of knowledge and its worth within narrative. Later, Milan Kundera takes up this notion, Brosch, in a way that describes essayism for Kundera in terms of, and this is another key term for me, the unachieved. The unachieved. And he writes, all great works contain something unachieved. And this unachieved can show us the need for, and these are his numbers, not mine, one, a new art of radical divestment, which can encompass the complexity of existence in the modern world without losing architectonic clarity. Secondly, a new art of novelistic counterpoint, which can blend philosophy, narrative, and dream into one music. And three, a new art of the specifically novelistic essay, which does not claim to bear an apodictic message, but remains hypothetical, playful, or ironic. Moving this model of essayism to the cinematic encompasses numerous films, which with little else in common than this divergent incorporation of an essayism that acts as a digressive critique embedded within the struggle to narrate. As with other prominent tendencies in the essay for me, the post-war history of the French New Wave becomes a real touchstone here, and films particularly such as the ones we all know well, René and Duras' Hiroshima Mon Amour, and I'm picking at random, you can have many others in your head, Godard's Contempt, which have in turn inspired a variety of international films that continue the exploration and interrogation of film narrative within the pull of narrative, including Glober Rochas, Antonio das Mortes, Helgi Sanders' Redupers, the all-round reduced personality, and I think virtually all of Peter Greenaway's work. These and more recent films mobilize essayism to question, most broadly, what counts in contemporary film and media culture, as they investigate how contemporary films engage, implicitly or often explicitly, problems of imagistic and narrative value in culture. There's that word. How movies can and do question our ways of seeing through the movies, and how the dynamics of cinematic looking can become a measure of value. To paraphrase Wallace Stevens, these films fracture and intensify narrative images in order to make the visible within the story a little hard to see. That is, to see beyond the teleologies and agencies of narrative, to move intelligence beyond the frames of vision, and to question the use value that increasingly defines the imagistic logic of new and old media today. Now, my two examples, if you read the abstract, are Terrence Malick's Tree of Life and Lech Majewski's The Mill and the Cross, both released only coincidentally, I think, in 2011. Both engaged with and questioning, not coincidentally, I think, a dominant Judeo-Christian narrative as the foundation of knowledge, and both opening on the edges of conventional narrative form. While Malick's film locates essayism as a movement beyond the boundaries of various narrative frames, where a perceptual grace expands, Majewski's film configures its essayism as an arresting of narrative movement that concentrates an intellectual and emotional insight within those frames. As works that integrate essayism into their stories, both films open pressing questions about the implicit value of the narrative and cinematic images they mobilize. Now, an apology here, I don't have any clips. Now, part of that, to be honest, is just, technology typically fails me when I give talks, and I just wasn't prepared to have that happen. But on the other hand, I'm going to say I intended that because, I have that Wallace Stevens phrase about making the visible within the story difficult to see. So I'm requiring you to listen up and to use your own imaginations here. So first with Malick's film. The Tree of Life is an oblique adaptation. And I'm assuming that many people have seen The Tree of Life. The Majewski, less so. But if you haven't seen it, I hope I inspire you to go out and see it because it's quite extraordinary. But the Malick film is an oblique adaptation of that pivotal epistemological tree that in the biblical book of Genesis, and less centrally the book of Job, as well as a deflected adaptation of Darwin's evolutionary tree in On the Origin of Species. Aimed at significantly redefining the limits of those works as trees of knowledge and evolution, Malick's film explores a narrative history in which knowledge and evolution have less to do with growth and progress and more to do with reflective ruptures of and branchings out of those earlier narrative visions, looking instead through and beyond both those frameworks. Two patterns inform and contend in this tale of a post-World War II family tree. On the one hand, experience appears through the perspectives based in appropriation, individuation, and circulation. And on the other, experience provides perspectives based in adaptation, de-individuation, and valuation. The intersection of these two developmental schemes propels the film's narrative in a way that continually seems to resist its own narrative logic, pulling away from that narrative as what I describe as a looking away, and that's my key metaphor here, a looking away from the subjectivities and progressions that anchor it, and so engaging its world on the essayistic edges of or outside the frames of a conventional narrative. Now, I know a lot of people really hate this film. And I think that, what I've just described there is, I think, whether you hate it or love it, it's really a difficult film to say, well, what's going on here, a lot of times. For good reason, I think. My reading is fascinated by, if you know the film, this animated evolutionary raptor who during that astonishing sequence moves ominously towards and then away from its potential prey, signaling, then swerving away from a Darwinian logic of appropriative conquest and from the spiritual beginning aligned with the Old Testament Genesis. Tree of Life is a paratactic narrative of fragments whose primary vehicle and drifting agent is the son, Jack O'Brien, and his perhaps coming of age between nature and grace, between the heritage of his father and that of his mother. For the father, life is about boundaries, control, and the ownership of ideas. He is appropriately an inventor, obsessed with use value rather than a creator of useless value, who struggles for survival while haunted by his lost potential and path as a pianist. Shaped by a vision of a linear plot and a horizontal perspective, his will to control and propertize human relations often desperately drives those familial relations forward. Unsettling this vision from the outset, however, the very beginning of the film flashes the narrative forward to the traumatic death of one son, a trauma that irrevocably troubles the father's agency and the genesis of the narrative that precedes and follows it. Conversely, Mrs. O'Brien shows Jack the way of grace, a way that opens emotionally onto a world in which she longs to surrender agency, the agency of personal control and direction. She drifts longingly through events and lives with a perspective that continually looks vertically, as opposed to the father's horizontal perspective, vertically askance into essayistic spaces and skies beyond the frames of her home and the frames of the image. The binary coupling that describes this and other Malick films accordingly include the push and pull between the logic of narrative and the space of essayism, between an anthropomorphic frame and its off-screen space, between continuity edits and unexpected temporal cuts. Within the tension of these two parental perspectives, Jack in his story struggles for coherence, mapped as decentered and fragmented flashbacks that, rather than orchestrating the past, pull the characters and their stories away from, I think, a narrative progression. With these two directions, quote, wrestling inside him, Jack's identity continually drifts and digresses from, rather than evolves through, visions and images of appropriation. He inhabits, in my terms, the spaces of essayism on the fringes of narrative, as he moves in and out of an open and fluid world defined by adaptation, de-individuation, and valuation. The Tree of Life and Jack's life specifically create a spreading evolution that deflects both expressivity and subjectivity. You know, that's back to that little tripartite scheme of mine about how subjectivity is not in some ways an anchor, but it is in some ways an opening up, a pulling apart. Most sensationally seen in those swirling, undefined images that punctuate the film and its 20-minute sequence of unseeable images in outer space. The characters, and specifically Jack, attempt to shape their own evolutionary autobiography from out of a cosmic bath of images and sounds, the vastness of which repeatedly threatens the discrete shape of individual autobiography itself. Rather than locate a linear connection between past, present, and future, the narrative flashbacks in the Tree of Life become a search for a genesis, or more accurately, many geneses, which might be better described as disruptive recollections that never adequately collect and circulate, as fractured and drifting images and moments producing not evolutionary lines, but the spreading reflective branches of essayism. Pulling away from the narrative becomes, at its most extreme moments, a de-evolution without direction, an essayistic deviation that describes graphically a looking away across frames and boundaries as a radically distinct mode of knowledge. Within the frames of the home, Jack's desires and looks continually wander past the edges of his social epistemological borders. On the fringes of his story are experiential detours into an awkward and uncomfortable encounter with an African-American community, a vague and secret exploration of a sexual crush on a young neighbor girl, and a strange and unsettling sighting of criminals or physically disabled figures on the edges of his vision. If the frames of the home in the film offer the possibility of a dwelling in place, those frames are dramatically porous, just as the boundaries of Jack's youthful perspective and the direction of his looks never stay still as they search the air for thought. Indeed, punctuating and infusing much of the film is the luminescence of this other world, eliciting new ways of thinking, created through lighting which Malick has called the magic hour. The hour when the source and centrality of the sun dissipates through and beyond the Earth's horizon and the focus of the frame. And one can see this, I think, in many Malick films well before this. Stylistically, the editing, oblique eyeline perspectives, elliptical cuts, and visual compositions dramatize unlocatable fragments of longing, jouissance, violence, and for me, ultimately, thought. The unassimilable, the undirected, the unexpected, the affective, the the essayistic. Even as an adult, Jack the architect, the Sean Penn of the film, creates and explores architectural spaces that are both open and closed within the transparent and reflective surfaces of the soaring skyscrapers. He inhabits and sees through modernist buildings with sharp angles and geometrical framings, spaces and shapes that contrast dramatically not only with the spaces and shapes of his desires and the world of nature that surround him, but also with the strained expression of his meditative and intensified close-ups in this film. Looking away in The Tree of Life means especially a looking away from the haunting humanistic questions about loss and violence, questions whose answers cannot be found within the frameworks of a narrative evolution and expressive individuation, but only in an adaptive inclusiveness that looks according to and accepts multi-directional perspectives beyond the frame. At one point, for instance, a voice questions, and if you know the film and remember, these voices seem to be coming from nowhere, or at least often unassigned. A voice questions, "What was it you showed me?" And the shot then opens up with a crane reverse pull across branches of trees below which boys play. If evolution is about expressive individuation through which a subject acts out the use value of progressive conquest, Malick offers questions only to have them visually and inadequately answered by a verticality that expands and dissipates human play through imagistic branches that point well beyond the frame of that play. As Leo Bersani and Ulysse Dutoit write about questions, their value in the individual, in their essay in Malick's The Thin Red Line, they say, language raises questions which language may be inherently unable to answer. The preponderance of the interrogative mode itself in Malick's films through voiceovers forecloses the possibility of a discursive solution, thus becoming, quote, a reworking of the individual within a new relational ethics. More to my point, and I'm still quoting Bersani and Dutoit, looking is simultaneous with asking. Looking at the world doesn't erase questions about the world, but it does inaccurately replicate those questions as viable relations to the world. I assume many of you were at Walter Salas's film and talk last night, and I might be being narcissistic, but there's some of this, including these passages here, were really resonating in what he had to say both about the film and for my money, his films as well. In my revision of this point for The Tree of Life, looking away dramatizes an essayistic dissipation into Kundera's notion of the unachieved, a digressive dissipation that discovers the value in images that open beyond themselves and beyond an appropriative circulating value. In a film where windows, doors, and portals regularly map and insistently demarcate the control of spaces and the limits of perspectives, such as Jack's odd punishment of having to repeatedly close a screen door in one peculiar scene, the perplexing final sequence of The Tree of Life, and I hope everyone was initially as perplexed as I was by this sequence, may describe the utopian fantasy of looking away from and through the gateways of family evolution that have haunted Jack, a fantasy of pure essayism beyond the borders of any narrative frame. Here, Jack climbs through a fragile illusionary portal, unsupported by walls, into an open landscape where family and friends from life wander and drift through a world seemingly without borders. Here, those essayistic directions and misdirections find, perhaps, some sort of redemption only by exceeding the portal of the frame and adapting that paratactic community that could never be contained in it or in any evolutionary narrative. This is a world that for Jack and for us has been and still is very hard to see. except perhaps by rejecting the exhaustion of appropriative looking and by adapting instead the wonder of not seeing. Now I'm changing directions radically here, and I'm not suggesting necessarily that there's any relationship between the Majewski film and this film as well. But I want to talk about the Majewski film now in the context that I set up in terms of essayism. Making the visible difficult to see as an epistemological provocation moves in a very different direction in Majewski's The Mill and the Cross, where the grand narrative that essayism disrupts and interrogates is nothing less than the story of Christ's crucifixion, a narrative Majewski encounters as an embedded image within Bruegel's 1564 painting, The Way to Calvary. Famously substituting Spanish Inquisition soldiers for the Roman centurions, Bruegel's painting depicts that grand narrative amidst an excess of daily events and figures that surround and immerse the almost invisible crucifixion somewhere at the center of this painting, which the film then drifts through, investigates, and reflects on as both an interrogation and meditation. As a counterpoint to Malick's integration of essayism as a movement outside the frames of vision, Majewski's film instead concentrates that vision as a difficult insight. And so if you want two buzzwords across my two readings, it's looking away and now insight itself, within extraordinary narrative complexity of the frame itself, an insight that works to overcome the distractions of the incidental permeating the narrative. In collaboration with Michael Gibson's book-length essay about Bruegel's painting, the film brings the painting to digital life, and it's really quite a remarkable digitalized film, by dramatizing and reframing the excess of incidents spread across the painting as a cinematic movement, achieved by replicating Bruegel's scene as a backdrop, his painting as a backdrop, and digitally filming the actors before it. As the soldiers of the Spanish Inquisition appear and disappear across the Flemish landscape in the film, daily life awakens with children playing, merchants selling wares, and a myriad of other figures and events that surround various brutal executions, with the crucifixion of Christ becoming the focus of the film only at its midpoint. Overseeing all these events, distractions, and brutalities is the mill and the miller, described as the great miller in heaven, whose grinding machinery perches above Bruegel's world and propels the narrative of the painting as movement. Essayism emerges on the digressive and unstable margins of that narrative. Bringing Bruegel's painting to cinematic life, the narrative of the film destabilizes narrative temporality itself, slipping anachronistically between past, present, and future, shifting between the crucifixion of Christ, Bruegel's adaptation of it within the 16th century persecutions in Flanders, and the present and future impact the painting displayed on the walls of a Vienna museum. These shifts and slippages in turn unsettle and disperse narrative agency in the film as they merge and expand different figures across the identification of multiple everyman and women, including Christ, to create a kaleidoscopic of narrative agents. At the center of the kaleidoscope, Bruegel himself enters the frame to contemplate the world he labors to represent as the primary but troubled creator of the story. As an essayist in dialogue with his interlocutor and art patron, Bruegel explains and comments on how to make and understand its imagistic stories, noting that the painting and the film is now part of, will tell, and this is the quote from the film, will tell many stories, and it should be large enough to hold everything. He will accordingly, quote, work like a spider, the figure of a dispersive essayist entangling the Christ event at the center of his imagistic web as it explores and tests the pathways of the world that surround and contain it. In both Bruegel's painting and Majewski's film, narrative and the knowledge it may traditionally have offered becomes scattered and potentially lost in a space of distraction in which numerous perspectives and framings mirror the narrative misdirections and interruptions that destabilize its story. The film specifically recreates the 7 or maybe 8 perspectives in the painting to redirect the linearity of any narrative path, just as the painting refuses the perspectival coherence of a quattrocentral point of view. As a variation on Malovich's painterly effect, the digital layering here through the film creates internal frames through the many doorways, windows, and passageways as distinctive planes of interaction, across which it becomes difficult to maintain a focus on an action or figure or to coordinate an interpretation within the larger frame. Within the different frames and planes of these moving distractions and conflicting perspectives, the film seeks, most importantly, I think, to pressure the difficulty of seeing within its narrative spaces and to inject the strained act of conceptual essayism into the tragic and brutal activity of the narrative, so as to generate thought as a literal insight. Indeed, the key moment in the film occurs when Bruegel tells his patron, "If only time could be stayed and we could wrestle the movement to the ground." Wrestle the moment to the ground. That moment occurs precisely when Bruegel signals the miller to suddenly stop the movement of the mill, which in turn arrests the movement of the narrative immersed in a web of distractions. This is the moment that Bruegel would paint and that Majewski narrates as a multi-layered tableau vivant. This is the crystallized and concentrated moment for me of essayism that arrests narrative mobility and the temporality of distraction in order to create within the frame a moment of thought as insight. In a flash of insight, with the stoppage of the mill, the distractions of our worldly narratives become supplanted by a vision and idea of human compassion within the web of human suffering. If Walter Benjamin famously championed in the 1930s the new art of film for its potential to open its frame to the productive experience of a public distraction, The Mill and the Cross redirects the viewer to the complex insights that could be and should be pursued within the frame of an essayistic concentration. This is, as Majewski claims, no traditional narrative, but rather a contemplative and philosophical project. If conventional narrative knowledge promises a signifying organization of time and space through the coherence of the agency that constructs it, here the instability of the knowledge demands new ways of knowing the world and our experience of it, new forms of concentration and insight found through the complex dialogic of the essayistic. Majewski reframes that narrative perspective within a digital landscape that insists on the imperative to see within it, arresting and refocusing the narrative as an essayistic insight. Whereas in Malick's film, the digital becomes, to put it simply, a way to represent the unseeable and unrepresentable beyond the frame of a narrative. In The Mill and the Cross, Majewski concentrates vision within the narrative to force or elicit thought and reflection as a conceptual and emotional pause. In the conclusion, The Mill and the Cross shifts and pans out from the painting The Way to Calvary as it hangs in the Vienna Museum. The film then pauses to concentrate on the image, and this is in a contemporary world, the image as the vortex of a narrative that draws the minds and eyes of a myriad of modern viewers, now perhaps drawn to the hard task of witnessing the essence of its thought. Now this is my final section here, which is I expand some of these ideas into dangerous contemporary climates. So get ready to be possibly offended. Cinematic value has, of course, never been simply a textual issue, and has always been subject to multiple social, historical, and industrial issues. More visibly than most practices, perhaps, films have always relied upon categories and classifications, because to value a film means to rank or rate it in an actual or imagined pecking order. This is the case where the value constitutes cost, tone, quality, morality, pleasure, or passion, or many of the other measuring sticks we use for cinematic value. The contemporary media context for the Tree of Life and The Mill and the Cross and other films today is, however, a culture in which making sense of cinematic images has dramatically shifted away from the conventional markers of filmic value. Today, imagistic value has been increasingly perceived in terms of an advancing and converging circulation in which, through the appropriative power of spectatorial screens and frames, all those things we have in our pocket and elsewhere, narrative use value seems to trumpet all other questions of value, whereby the rapid and defining growth of different venues within those so-called circulations of convergence cultures celebrate among more specific actions evolutionary appropriation and expressive individuation. By this I mean, in a reductive way, I completely realize, that imagistic value today now frequently seems centered on the use values defined by fan culture, social networks, and other new media or contemporary activities that appropriate images as part of a continually evolving circulation of those images within the individualized, if not narcissistic, frames of value. While this context for contemporary film and media culture might seem distant from essayistic cinema and essayism specifically, I see it as a dominant cultural movement and frame against which cinematic essayism now looks and moves dramatically away from its insistence on the difficult search for thought, value, and insight. Within the contemporary cultural context of individuated world buildings, evolutionary conquests, and narrative distractions, The Tree of Life, The Mill and the Cross, and other films today detour into an essayism that builds worlds that exist elsewhere, beyond narrative frames and within narrative frames, into which the subject and viewer adapt by embracing the difficulty of seeing as knowing. In the context of their argument about Malick's films, Bersani and Dutoit describe this as the creation of an anarchic receptivity, of images in which the precondition of this wholly receptive gaze, quote, is a subject divested of subjectivity, and so becomes a subject without claims on the world. So unlike the terms of narrative circulation and appropriation in today's convergence cultures, this alternative way of seeing demands an active passivity, that's their phrase, an active passivity, in a community grounded in anonymity and held together by an absence of both individuality and leadership, and where to recognize that the most powerfully individuated perspective on the world is also the erasure of perspective itself. These movements of essayism outside the frames of perspective or concentrated within them become indeed a difficult way to see. And therein lies, I think, the crucial value of the essay, the essayistic, and essayism today. Thanks. And I believe we have time for questions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, extremely inspiring talk. I'm not so sure it's as provocative as you have.
Oh, good.
As you have announced. I was just thinking about your proposition of looking away and looking into, thinking about the position of an author that deconstructs herself, a subjectivity that has no claims on the world, and that talks about a world elsewhere, because it didn't provide us with any imagery and asked us to resort to our own power of imagination.
Right.
I was then thinking about the film of yesterday that you also quoted, where I can identify some of these features, but probably not.
Yeah,
all of them. Could you?
Sure. I mean, I will say. No, that's fine.
Okay.
I mean, I will say that this use of the Malick film and the Majewski film, and sort of following my particular argument in terms of notion of looking away and insight. I don't know to what extent I would expand those as being sort of universally useful ways of talking about essayism. They seem to me to be specific strategies in these films for me through which that what I'm calling the pull or the appropriative power of narrative works in terms of their particular work. Lucia here, mentioning the film that Walter Salas's film was. I mean, I did think about that. I think one would need completely different terms, but what struck me about his portrait, Joe, was that he did describe him, and this is a term that's come up regularly in this conference in terms of the auteuristic and auteurs and so forth, as a figure, as a filmmaker who is constantly redefining himself and constantly sort of opening himself to the world in different ways, so that he never becomes fully locked within that traditional auteurist perspective away. I think that if you look, one would have to sort of look at these films. I think one could find that kind of movement, a very and use terminology that would be quite different, but one in which it does in some ways doesn't prioritize the narrative, but the ways in which figures wander outside it. And in terms of his own careers, an auteur which continually in some ways wanders outside of his own previous narrative structures and so forth. And I was struck, with what he had to say about how, that just early films, he really in some ways valorized the notion of it's not about us, but about the individual, as a kind of movement away from a grand Marxist narrative of some sort. But later in his career, he sort of turns on that itself and talks about the way in which, that sort of championing of the I has within contemporary culture threatened to some ways become, something that is, fully narcissistic in the way that I'm talking about some models of new media culture in that way.
Fabulous. We are now open to the floor, so if you have any questions, please raise your hands. Yes, please.
Thanks for the wonderful talk. I feel like I have two questions. So first of all, in your talk, you draw a dichotomy between narrative and essayism.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you have any thoughts on how essayism would relate to spectacle. And then, should I have another question?
Yeah, that's the other one, because that might be easier.
So the second question is, in your book, you seem that you have an inclusive definition of essay film.
Yep.
And so I was wondering if you had examples of films, or if you could describe a film that tends towards essayism, but then doesn't really meet the criteria for essayism.
Well, let me try the first one first, which is the way in which spectacle, in some ways, might be a framework, or at least a ground on which that kind of activity of what I'm calling essayism works out. Yeah, I think it can. I mean, I think, there is, again, I would sort of rethink this in terms of, specific films and filmmakers in a way. And the way I would distinguish it is there's a way in which I think that, in your kind of typical Hollywood blockbuster, spectacle becomes in some ways something that's incorporated as a kind of the central point in the narrative. It becomes, very much about the kind of climactic moment in the narrative, or the kind of turning point within a narrative, or these moments of spectacle of one sort or another, and often associated with special effects in a way. and the way in which I see spectacle working in films which are more interested in, for me, this detour provided by essayism would be a way of which in some ways rupturing that narrative logic itself. And to a certain extent, I think it's, one finds it, in the Malick film, if you look at those films as they, in some ways absolutely unexpected and illogical ways, they create a spectacular scene that, as you watch it, doesn't seem to in some ways fit with the sort of narrative logic that would normally incorporate it as a key moment in that way. Now the second question was about the ways in which certain narrative films, according to my restrictive definition of essayism, might sort of gesture in that direction but fall flat in that way. Yeah, I don't know, I'd have to think about that. I'm sure there are many in that way. Although, to tell you the truth, I'm even if they fall flat, I'd have to think about, which ones would come to mind immediately. I think that that kind of movement, whether it's entirely successful or not, makes these films interesting for me. That they, in some ways are trying to introduce, some kind of detour, ones that I associated with thought, one sort or another, within the kind of pressure of a story, a star, an agent.
Thank you. More questions? Volunteer the next question.
Yeah?
Yeah, Zero?
I just had a question about your early comments about the nature of the authorial deconstructing, or the subjectivity, the reflexivity of the filmmaker, intentionally or otherwise, going through some kind of transformative process or deconstructive process in their essayistic mode. You mentioned the 5 obstructions.
Yeah.
Which makes me think of if that does fit within that broad scheme, and yet they're obviously the filmmaker who's intentionally deconstructing another. They're being deconstructed in that way. You just talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I think what I mentioned, the 5 obstructions, and I can't remember what was the other one I mentioned. Yeah, the close-up in that way is that I don't in both those cases, at least in my reading of them, I read them pretty much straight up as essay films in that way, because it's a question of the narrative in some ways becomes the subject of the film rather than the subjects of the film becoming part of the narrative. But in both those films, my reading of it is that particularly the Von Trier film seems to me to be almost an explicit and typically confrontational attempt to sort of undo in a fairly masochistic way, the auteur left of the film. And in the process, and this is where I find that film interesting too, I think in the process, you see even, the enormous ego of Von Trier itself becoming in some ways pressurized to deassemble itself in that way. And in a somewhat different and perhaps even more complex way, I think the Kiarostami film plays with that notion too of, and again fairly explicitly about, what do we do with an auteur? And, an auteur who from the beginning is a complete fake, and what does that mean? And I think it's a really interesting film about how, in investigating the fake auteur, that film generates a pretty complex thought on, auteurism itself, and including Kiarostami's own, and Maklabov and everyone associated with that film too. Now, with these films, with the narrative films, I think this question of the auteur is frequently less explicit. I mean, Malick is sort of a somewhat notoriously invisible auteur, and I don't know if I would be willing to sort of say that these films are about auteurism. I think they're about authority, and they're about authorial agencies in different ways. And I think that those become, one can think about those in some ways as paralleling or metaphoric for that bigger issue of auteurism in that way.
Yes, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting stuff. And I noted that at a few points you used the word adaptation,
Yeah.
which I know is one of your things.
Yeah.
And,
You caught me.
and so I'm trying to reconstruct, perhaps what might be at stake there. And so I'm thinking, well, is it that every adaptation is, in a sense, someone's essay about a source that they make an adaptation of, and that might in some ways be evident in the finished product, often it won't be, perhaps. So, but that's just my guess of what may be in your head there. So I wonder if you can give us, what's...
Yeah. I mean, I sort of secretly slipped that in, because the other thing that, besides value, that I've been interested in is the way in which adaptation studies these days, have exploded in really interesting directions, and how, what some of the really interesting ways that relates to what I was talking about here is that I think really interesting adaptations, have contemporary ones, and this might sound like, an obvious truism, have moved radically away from notions of fidelity and authority in a way, either implicitly or explicitly in that way. And so, I like that metaphor of adaptation as another way of opening up or engaging the problem of authority and agency and fidelity to, in many ways, disperse it. And I think there are plenty of interesting, literal adaptations out there. The term that I like as a kind of metaphor for this kind of adaptation as it relates to these other things I'm talking about here is the Bazantern refraction, where he's talking about it not as a kind of imitation of a reflection, but as a kind of refraction of a source into multiple directions in that way. And I think that that's a really useful way to talk about a lot of interesting adaptations these days.
If I could pick up on Jonathan's question here, and thinking about the essay film as a form which is in between. It's film but trying to be something else. And when you talk about essayism as an aspiration to a world elsewhere, I was just thinking about The Mill and the Cross as a film with that ardent aspiration of becoming another medium, which is painting. Yeah. So I was thinking about intermediality, and the film as a prison that doesn't allow this realization of becoming something else. I was wondering how closely related both adaptation and intermediality as concepts are to the essay.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's not. I mean, I think that, in terms of contemporary culture and contemporary adaptation studies, this notion of intermediality, very much and concretely acts out, a version of refraction in terms of the kind of multiple frameworks and multiple platforms that it potentially makes open in terms of our relationship to a source text or something, as it spreads it in that way. My one reservation about intermediality is in my really sort of grumpy talk about some of the new media stuff, is it's, the danger is, I think, is the way in which it becomes simply a reperformative point, where what's being in some ways, what's being created in an intermediate moment is simply a reperformance of that that new auteur, that new position in some ways, rather than using it as a way to fracture open a particular text. So it's, and performance has come up today quite a bit, Cecilia and other people have talked about it, but it's a way of talking about performance, at least as it relates to things like intermediality. It's not as a kind of simply a reappropriation, but a way of, in some ways, using performance itself to bring into questions the authority of the performance itself, again and again. And I think intermediality has that capabilities. And that's, frankly, I gestured towards this before. And, I do think that in terms of the essayism, there's so much that's going on that relates to intermediality these days and to different platforms. And, I do think that in one sense, at least in terms of my definition, as it talks about this, the kind of dialogic, the performative, the dispersal of agency, that the media that's made for it is the internet. I think I fortunately or unfortunately am completely not at home with the internet at all. I can check my email and things like that. But it seems to me that structurally, in other ways, given its public performative position, is that we're waiting for, and maybe it's already happened and I just haven't seen it yet. We're waiting for the Montaigne of the internet to show up, and maybe there's something more.
My friend on Facebook, so maybe.
Can I, if you don't mind, just to follow up, because it came up in a panel that I was in before, and our friend Adam over here made this point, which was really to say that it sounds like what you're talking about then is that you're trying to, well, how can I put this? You're trying to save or continue a kind of heritage of modernism, really, in terms of the clashing of mediums and that kind of seriousness, which is not the same as play.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, at least a version of modernism itself, as it sort of evolves into some version of postmodernism, if people believe in that, I think, yeah. Because, I don't want to sound like I think that, Chris Marker is Montaigne reborn. But I do think there's a lot of lessons about, what's specific about, what Montaigne is doing at the very beginning of the modern era, that in some ways has moved through what's distinctive about these more contemporary forms and so forth. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Well, thank you for such a rich paper. So with so much to think about, and it's really difficult because there's so many aspects of it. But the two thoughts. One is it's clearly a huge difference, despite the fact that we keep always saying at these various conferences that documentary is fiction, really, and fiction is documentary, sort of citing Razier in some way. But obviously, there is a big difference between a film like Malick's film that you're talking about and some forms of documentary with a moment of reflection and disruption.
Right.
So maybe talk about that. And secondly, the criteria that you gave for essayistic mode of expression, could take us somewhere interesting and slightly unexpected. So I've been thinking, as you were talking, what other film could I think of that would fall into that group and yet possibly be problematic as an essayistic or essay film? And of course, the Nymphomaniac.
Yeah.
It's quite a good example.
Yeah.
You have a disruption, you have a reflection, you have all kinds of other things going on there. But then one wonders, would you still put it into that category?
I mean, this category of a narrative that in some ways incorporates a kind of essayism within it.
So two questions.
Yeah, okay. What was the first one again?
The kind of relationship between a documentary essay and
first of all, when I'm talking about narrative, for me it works like this, that when I'm talking about essayism, it seems to me that it is a kind of, whatever we want to call it, it's something that in many ways intervenes within usually a kind of fictive form, if we consider narrative as fundamentally a fictive construct in that way. So that in some ways the predominant representational practice there always, usually, sometimes is a kind of fictive construction which it tries to in some ways intervene within. What I think happens with, strictly speaking, essays or essay films is that one finds that the predominant form is this structure of the essay. And that too then can incorporate, within it, fictive forms. It can incorporate any different kinds of forms as well. But they're in some ways, as opposed to these examples of essayism, It's the essayistic, which is controlling the perspective. It can assimilate, reenactments, any kind of form along the way. But with these other forms, I'm thinking of, that there's a way in which essayism itself, in some ways, defers to the already either fictive or constructed practice and tries to, in many ways, subvert it or to disrupt it in a way. And I talk about narrative here, but I think potentially, one could talk about any kind of practice itself, fictive or not, in which, my good friend Nora Alter has done work on sort of installations, museum installations, in the way in which one can find, I don't know if she'd follow my argument here, a kind of interruption or a kind of digression within the space of a museum, not necessarily as a fictive form itself, but as a kind of traditional dominant form in that way.
So, nymphomaniac is in fact...
No, I don't know how to answer that. If I have to answer without being sure, I'd say yes. But, I think that, I like the nymphomaniac films, and I like, many of his recent films too. Because, and I need to really look carefully at these examples to be sure of myself in that way. But, I think if we know those films, even our first glance at them, they really, to use my little buzz metaphor here, they really do instead of work to make the visible difficult to see in terms of them, which is something.
Yes, please.
My question's about what you're saying about the visual and whether one has to completely distrust the visual, that it's apparent proliferation, apparent saturation. I can relate this to an event at the Cambridge International Festival of the Art of Cinematography when, about 5 years ago, David Lynch addressed an audience of about 600 cinematographers and cinematography students from all across Europe. And the first thing he said was, filming about what you don't see, at which there was a tremendous cheer from the audience. Because people who really concentrate on making an image know that it isn't just about seeing.
Right. Yeah.
And I just find it very curious that so much of contemporary film theory has this distrust because of the saturation.
This distrust of the visual. So.
Yeah, or a simplistic reading of what a visual actually.
Yeah. Why film theory itself has a distrust of it, typically?
Well, could you say a little bit more about what you mean by...
Yeah, what I mean, I think that there's, big arguments to about, why I think in Western culture there's been a distrust of the visual, but I won't go there. But I do think, in terms of what I mean, it's not the visual in itself that I think is the problem. I think, to use some of the terms I've used here, is the kind of the appropriation of the visible within different reductive interpretive structures in a way that, at least in terms of the kind of filmmakers, that there's a way in which, this point of view would be that, narrative potentially, in the way that it reclaims images themselves, tends to in some ways reduce, for many filmmakers, the richness and the complexity of their values in that way. And it's that kind of appropriation of images within other frameworks itself, to go back to what I just said about narrative, of claiming the visual as in some ways defined by a framework of one sort or another. And I think there's an effort to say, the visual is fantastic, but it's so bigger and more complex than is often traditionally allowed it in that way.
Right. Any more questions? Okay, so I think we are bringing this to a close. A big round of applause.
Thank you.